All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. I figured I gave everybody 5 extra minutes this morning. This way, a little Simchas Yom Tov, 5:50 instead of 5:45. So it makes it a little bit easier. So Rabbi, say let's begin. Emeretz Hashem by thanking all of our sponsors for learning. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zayda, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz, Moshe Ben Avram, David. Thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the Shurim this month in the schus of Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha. Adam and Yudit Ben Zev for dedicating the Shurim this month in the schus of all of our tefillas being niskabel. Our week of learning sponsors, Ira Miriam Grossman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Ira's father, Melech Ben Azriel, and Avi Zeisman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his mother, Ziva Bas Avram, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of all of our learning, V'neshama Slav and Aliyah, those who acquire refuah, should have one together with Kol Choleis. So also with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Tzadik Ches, 98. If it's okay, what we're just going to do is, we're just going to jump back to the Mishnah on. It's powerful, Mishnah, by the way. Like a powerful, no, I'm good as long as, so we're going to jump back to the Mishnah on Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis 97b. Just quickly go through it, as it'll set the table a little bit for our sugya ahead. So the Mishnah 97b. Machlok Ksuvasa o Miktsasa. If a woman sells her ksuva, or she sells off part of it, mashkina ksuvasa o miktsasa, or she collateralized her ksuva or some part of it, nasna ksuvasa la'achar o miktsasa, or she went ahead and she gifted her ksuva to someone else, either all of it or part of it. Lo simkar es hasha'ar el babezdin. Halacha l'maisa, she should not go ahead and sell off the rest of the ksuva outside of Beis Din. If you look at Rashi says over here, Lo simkar es hashar. Rabbi Shimon kamar la, da amar ein mocher shelo babeis din ela lemizonos. Rabbi Shimon is, now this Mishnah is reflecting the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, in general, a woman is not permitted to sell property outside of Beis Din except for mizonos. Vizu, from finishing Rashi, vizu mechevan shegavsa miktsasa eimla mizonos. So Rabbi said it's actually very interesting. The Mishnah is highlighting an idea over here that once a woman begins to sell off part of her ksuva, she loses the right for mizonos. That's what's unfolding over here. In other words, we've seen this concept before, that support from the estate is there as long as the woman does not claim her ksuva. Once she claims her ksuva, she forfeits mizonos. Therefore, again, once she sells off, collateralizes, or gifts part of her ksuva, ultimately, she's lost mizonos. Well, if she's lost mizonos, Rabbi Shimon says, she needs to, anything done regarding the ksuva has to be done in Beis Din. Because the only rights that a woman has to sell stuff off outside of Beis Din is from mizonos. But once again, you gift, collateralized, or sell part of your ksuva, you no longer have mizonos. The Chacham say, Chacham say, no, she could even sell off or do whatever, collateralize, gift, part of her ksuva even 4 or 5 times. So ultimately, again, she could go ahead and sell off for mizonos outside of Beis Din. So Rosh says another interesting halacha outside of Beis. So for mizonos, a woman is permitted to go ahead and sell off property, to go ahead and take care of whatever she needs for her support. However, the Mishnah says that halacha l'maisa, she should go ahead and write that she is selling for mizonos. She should indicate that she's selling for mizonos. A grusha lo simkar ala Beis Din, but a grusha ultimately should only sell property inside of Beis Din itself. Beautiful. We'll say that is the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Masnisin money. Whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon, the Sanya machla ksuvasa, mishkena ksuvasa, asasa ksuvasa, potkila achar in mizonos. Because now we quote the Brisa. The Brisa says, a woman sells her ksuva, she goes ahead and collateralizes her ksuva, she makes her ksuva an apotiki. Both apotiki, remember again, is a contraction, apotehei kai. That's if she's borrowing money and she wants to go ahead and establish her ksuva as a source of payment. Ultimately, again, apotiki la'achar in lamizonos. So we'll say, so remember again, our Mishnah is reflecting this core concept, which is that once a ksuva is used as either again, to sell part of it, to collateralize part of it, to gift part of it, to use it as an apoteki, so mazonos stops. So this is really a fascinating idea. Once a woman makes a move to cash in on the ksuva, mazonos is shut down. That's it. We're done with mazonos. And once we're done with mazonos, so first of all, obviously that's a big thing for her to go ahead. And I will say, somebody asked me the other week, I was saying that that's the case that a woman gets mazonos, why would she ever want to cash in her ksuva? In other words, obviously if she gets remarried, she'll already get mazonos. But why would a woman never want to go, why would a woman ever want to give up why would she ever want to cash in her ksuva? So obviously, you want your ksuva. Why? Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, there's a what do they call, a lump sum payment. Whereas mazonos is great, but ksuva offers you a lump sum of capital in any event. So the point the Gemara is making over here is our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon says once she makes a move to collect on the ksuva, even partially, mazonos is done. Mazonos is done. Rabbi Shimon says, "Afapi shlamach Rav Lamashkina ksuvas ela machzisa of the mazonos." Ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon says that halacha l'maisa, even if she did not go ahead and sell the ksuva in its entirety, but rather just part of it, so halacha l'maisa, she loses mazonos. So we'll say so again. What's the point of contention over here? The point of contention is like this. Everyone agrees. Well, let's go back. What does everyone agree with? Right? Everyone agrees that if she collects the ksuva in total, then what's the halacha? No more mazonos. What's the machlokes? Partial collection. Partial sale, partial collateralization. What happens then? Tanakama holds that halacha l'maisa, she still gets mazonos. Rabbi Shimon holds halacha l'maisa, she loses mazonos. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Lememra, the Rabbi Shimon savar the lo aminan miktas kasef kakol kasef." Is that to say that Rabbi Shimon holds that ultimately, again, partial money is not like complete money? V'Rabbanan samri aminan afilu miktas kasef kakol kasef ha'ipcha shemin alahu. We've actually seen just the opposite. This Sanya. Here we go. V'hi isha bivsulaha. Prat labogera. So we'll say, so it sounds like what Rabbi Shimon is saying is that halacha l'maisa, part is like the whole, and ultimately, again, the Rabbanan are saying part is not like the whole. But we've seen just the opposite. So the pasuk says, "V'hu isha b'vsulah." So we'll say the Gemara over here is talking about the Kohen Gadol, right? Kohen Gadol has to marry a b'sula. Prat lebogera shakalu b'sulah tiv Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, this is actually interesting. So we normally assume that a basula means a woman who's never had relations. Comes along Rabbi Meir says, the fact that the Kohen Gadol has to go ahead and marry a basula indicates, let's say, he cannot marry a bogeres. Now, what was it? What's a bogeres? 12 years old and 6 months. But 1 second, why isn't the bogeres a basula? So we'll say, here's what's interesting. We've spoken about this extensively in Yevamis. We make the assumption that halacha l'maisa, as a woman gets older and physically matures, the besulim themselves thin out. Which again, we know just halacha l'maisa, right? That sometimes besulim themselves could rupture, even not through tashmish, even not through intercourse, but ultimately again just through activity. So therefore, again, a Kohen Gadol can't marry. So Rabbi Meir says it even comes to exclude a bogeres. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon machshirim bogeres. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon hold that no, even a bogeres is fine. So I will say, the idea is, what do you see from here? So what you see from here is Rabbi Shimon holds that a bogeres is a woman who doesn't have complete besulim, so to speak, but it's enough. As long as some of the besulim are intact, she's a besula. Oh, so it's interesting. So the Gemara is trying to take that same logic and apply it to where? To ksuva. We would think, therefore, that Rabbi Shimon would hold like this, that even having some of the ksuva intact is still like having a ksuva and she should collect mazonos. Yet Rabbi Shimon holds here that what? Even partial collection of ksuva is enough to end mazonos. To which the Gemara says, that is such a strange comparison. Hasam b'krai pligi. We'll say here it's a machlokes about psukim. Rabbi Meir saver besula filu mikzas besulim. Rabbi Meir holds the pasuk says besula as long as there's some part of besulim that's intact, the Kohen Gadol can marry this woman. Besulaha. What does besula come to teach me? Adi ika kulu besulim. Until all the besulim are intact. Bivsulaha. Bivsula teaches me that what? Kedarka in, shalo kedarka lo. Only be a kedarka, but not be a shalo kedarka. Rabbi Shimon Savri, Besula shlema mashma. Rabbi Shimon holds besula means complete. Bisula afilu mixas besulim. Bisula even means some of the besulim top of tzadik ches. Bivsulaha shukol bisulaha kayamin bein kidarka bein shelo kidarka. Good. So we'll say. So therefore, essentially, what the Gemara says is like this. It's a separate machlokis. Let's not intertwine the two. There's a machlokis by what does besula mean by kohen gadol. Okay, that's a machlokis. But I will say, so we wanted to go ahead and intertwine both of these teachings to teach me that, and to actually raise a question between the sheet of Rabbi Shimon here, Rabbi Shimon by Besula. Kamashal, they're two different things. Well, I'll say good. Let's refocus and reorient. What are we focused on? Woman tries to go ahead and collect part of her ksuva. Not tries, she does. She cashes in part of the ksuva. Right? She goes in and collateralizes part of the ksuva. She sells part of the ksuva. So what's our question? What happens now regarding mizonos? Does that effectively end her ability to go ahead and collect mizonos? To which Rabbi Shimon says, absolutely yes. That's the shita of Rabbi Shimon. But again, that shita itself is subject to machlokes. What's the machlokes? Essentially, Rabbi Shimon says is once you move on the ksuva, once you begin to collect in any form, mizonos ends. Tanakama, on the other hand, holds no. As long as there is some part of your ksuva that remains uncollected, ultimately, again, you still have the right to collect mizonos. Fundamental machlokes. Here we go. Top of Tzadik Ches, second line down. There was a woman who went ahead and seized the tafsa means she seized kasa de kaspa, silver cup. Rashi says, tafsa kasa de kaspa, v'lo haya bashir ksuvasa. Shabbos said, let's assume right now we're talking about just like a regular ksuva. So what happens? Halacha l'maisa. Let's say the ksuva is worth 200 zuz. She seized a silver cup from the estate that was worth, we'll call it 100 zuz. 100 zuz. Okay. So therefore, what she seized, it was not valuable enough to satisfy her ksuva debt. Okay, so what happens? So katava mizoni. Okay, so we'll say, so what is this a case of? This is a case of partial collection of a ksuva. So she now sees the silver cup worth 100 zuz to pay off part of her ksuva. Now she comes and she claims what? Mizonos. She wants mizonos. So what's the halacha? Asay lekamei de Rava. She came before Rava. Amrluli asked me, Zilu havalu mizonos. So Rava said, give her mizonos. Give her mizonos. Right? Why should you give her mizonos? So the Gemara goes on. Zilu havalu mizonos. Less dechash lahad Rabbi Shimon. The amar lo armina mikzas kesef kechol kesef. We don't hold like Rabbi Shimon. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, partial collection of the ksuva does not shut down her ability to go ahead and collect mizonos. Shalach le'Rabba b'rei d'Rabba l'Rav Yosef mocharesh shelo b'beizdin tzricha shvua o ein tzricha shvua. So we'll say, now we're transitioning a little bit over here to a different topic. So we'll say, what's interesting about this is this last piece of the Gemara seems to indicate that we are not paskening like Rabbi Shimon, and therefore, when does mizonos essentially end? When does mizonos end? After full collection of a ksuva. Or in other words, saying a little bit differently, as long as there's some amount of the ksuva which remains uncollected, remains outstanding, she has the right to mizonos. Only once the ksuva is fully collected does the right to mizonos. And that's what it sounds like we're saying now. We'll see what the halacha l'maisa is. Transitioning now to another discussion. Listen to this. So shalach le'Rabba b'rei d'Rabba l'Rav Yosef mocheres shelo b'beizdin. So we'll say, what happens if a woman is selling off estate property outside of Beizdin? Tzricha shvua? Oh, ain't tzricha shvua. Does she need an oath or not? Does she, look at Rashi, tzricha shvua shelo gav seyos. Now, what's the oath over here? The oath over here is that she hasn't collected more than she is entitled to. Right? Because remember, again, I will say, if she's selling off property outside of Beizdin, so there is a certain amount of what's the word? There's a certain lack of oversight that's occurring over here. So the question is, okay, we're going to allow her. And I will say, by the way, when do we allow a woman to sell property outside of Beizdin? So this is a machlokes. For mizonos, everyone agrees that she's able to. For ksuva, that becomes a bit more complicated. But in any event, if she's, whatever the circumstances are, if she's selling off property outside of Beis Din, do we require a shvua in order to ensure that she is not taking advantage of the situation and not taking more money than she is entitled to? To which the Gemara says, "V'tibaylach hachraza." 1 second, before you go ahead and you get into shul about hachraza. Now, both say hachraza is fascinating. Hachraza, what does hachraza literally mean? Announcing. They will say, when you sell real estate, when you sell real property, so the shaila is, if you sell it off quickly, you lose the potential for what? Like, if you do an off-market deal, right? What's the challenge with doing an off-market deal? Is people don't know about it. If people don't know about it, you may lose out on the opportunity to make more money. So hachraza literally means, hachraza is like effectively like hanging the sign out on the front lawn, right, for sale. So do you require an announcement before selling off property of the yisomim? So Amarle, hachraza lo kamei barli. No, I'm not worried about hachraza. In other words, or I don't have a question about hachraza. Why not? Don't Rabbi Zera, Amrav Nachman, Almana sheshama liatzma lo asasav lo klum. Interesting case. An almana who valuated the property for herself. Now look at Rashi, third line from the top on Rashi. Sheshama liatzma lo chasa dehayishom liatzma b'shumas ksubasa. She took the property of the estate for herself in a valuation of her ksuva. Right? So in other words, she's assessed property and selling it off for herself in the satisfaction of her ksuba. Rashi says, lo asaklum. Now the Gemara says, I'm sorry, such an act is ineffective. Rashi says, v'im ratzu yisomim lahagbos mos la'achar zman chozun v'notlin osa. Shabbos says, so again, so this is talking about a very specific case. If a woman goes ahead and identifies a piece of property in the estate and she says, oh, that property is 200 zuz, good, I'm taking that. She assesses it, evaluates it for herself, and then she takes it. Such an act is meaningless. Meaningless meaning that Allah Chalamaysa, if the Yisomim want to come back and pay her, right, pay the value of the piece of property and take it back, they have the right to do so. So what's the case? Hechi dami, ida achros. We'll say if before taking it, she went ahead and announced it, so that Lamaisa, again, she could ensure that she would get top dollar for it. Amaylo asavalo klum. Ultimately, again, why is her action meaningless? Elalav delo achros. It must be, again, it was never any kind of announcement. And what? Uli atzmahu delo asavalo klum. The reason, ultimately, again, it's not good is because she's seizing this property for herself. So the Gemara says, Hala acher Masha asta. But yet I will say it sounds like if she was going ahead and selling this property to someone else, even without a hachraza, even without some type of announcement, ultimately the sale would be good. To which the Gemara says, no, the olam, the achrus. In reality, we're talking about a case where she announced, right? She publicized, that's the word, publicized. She publicized the fact that this parcel of land was going to be seized in satisfaction of a debt. So the Amrila man shamleich, and we ask her, who evaluated it for you? And there's a say, valuation of property is not a simple thing, right? Valuation of property requires some level of pikchus, right? Some level of understanding, and therefore the problem is if she's seizing significant property without valuation, that's problematic. That's problematic. Kiha, so the Gemara says, Kihai dahu gavra da'afkidu gabe kista diasmi. Listen to this case. There was a guy called Ruvain, and Ruvain, they deposited with him kista diasmi. Rashi says mispo. Mispo is fodder, animal fodder. So they deposited the Yisomim, listen to this case. So that this Yisomim deposited animal fodder with Ruvain. Now what happened, Abba say? Now, by the way, there's another piece of the Gemara doesn't say. The father of the Yisomim had borrowed money from Ruvain and never paid it back. Never paid it back. Right? So now Ruvain has in his possession fodder, right, from the estate of the now deceased borrower, the Yisomim. Now, I don't know if the Yisomim knew this, didn't know this. The point is the Yisomim deposited the fodder with Ruvain. Ruvain is owed money by the father of the Yisomim. Okay, so now what happens? So the Gemara says, Azal, Shaman Arma Be'azuzi. So ultimately, again, Ruvain went ahead and assessed the value of the fodder at 400 zuz. Ayakar kam b'shismea. Ultimately, again, then it appreciated and ultimately became worth 600 zuz. So I will say, so now remember, the unwritten part of the story over here is that Reuven seized the fodder for himself in satisfaction of the debt that the deceased father of the Yisomim owed him. So the Gemara is Rabbi Ami. So again, obviously the Yisomim were not very happy with this. So they come up for Rabbi Ami. Amarle man sham lach. Who evaluated this for you? In other words, who made this valuation for you? Rashi says, man sham lech mimi kibalt mechirazu lo mi beizim lo mi Yisomim. Lefichach lo yotza. I'm sorry. So misham lach means who made this valuation for? In other words, I will say, when seizing property from Yisomim, there must be some external appraisal, which makes a lot of sense. You see the length to which Chazal go in order to go out and safeguard the property of the Yisomim. The last thing we want is people making their own personal appraisals, right, with absolutely no oversight, with no external mechanism, and seizing property of Yisomim like that. So it comes up for Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami says, who went ahead, who appraised that for you? Now go back to Rashi. Look at Rashi. Man shamleich mimi kibalt mechirazu lo mi bezdin v'lo mi yisomim. Right? Who appraised that for you? Bezdin didn't. Yisomim didn't. Lefichach lo yatzikar k'meshusay yisomim. Aval heicha deshamta lachrini navak mershus yeshem shari nastu lachachamim mershus limkar. So we'll say, so this is interesting. We're making a distinction now between an appraisal you make for yourself versus an appraisal you make for others. So when you're keeping property seized by the Yisomim, that requires what? External appraisal, right? If ultimately, again, you're selling it off, like the case of an Isha, for either Mizonos or for Ksuva, it's possible that in that case you would not require an external appraisal. Now, let's say by that lashon of Misham Lach, who appraised this for you? You know, there's a beautiful Gemara Masechah Sota. Actually, the Ramchal quoted it in the second chapter, the third chapter of Mesilas Yesharim. The Gemara used lashon of Kalasham Archosav Ba'olam Hazeh. A person who evaluates, Sham Shuma is evaluation. A person who appraises, who evaluates his pathways in this world, Zocha V'roa, ultimately again has a meaningful, beautiful life both in this world and the world to come. But I will say, so which the Ramchal, the Gemara, both the Gemara and Ramchal talking about the idea about appraising or evaluating the path you choose in life. And you have to choose for yourself the right derech. So it's interesting that over here the Gemara used the lashon of who's appraising it for you. So I will say, so sometimes in life, it's not just enough to appraise or to evaluate the right derech in life. You have to make sure you have someone who can help you in that process. Because sometimes my kalim for personalistic appraisal and valuation are a little bit off. So if I'm doing the valuation by myself, for myself, often I can get myself into trouble. So the Gemara says, Mishallah, who's appraising it for you? Who's appraising it for you? They need in life, right? They need in life to have someone outside of you who you could turn to for Eitzah, for Hadracha, as a sounding board. It could be a friend, it could be a spouse, it could be a Rebbe, it could be whoever it is. But Lamai says sometimes we need someone outside of ourselves who could help us appraise things for what they really are. Ve'hilchasa, they will say, what is the halacha? Ve'hilchasa, tzricha shvua, ve'ina tzricha hachraza. So we'll say, so first of all, halacha l'maisa, again, a shvua is required whenever, again, we are selling off property of the Yisomim. Ultimately, again, a shvua is going to be required for collection to make sure that no one is collecting more than they are due. But ultimately, again, there is no hachraza, there is no announcement that is necessary ultimately before going ahead and either selling off or collateralizing that property. And I both say this is actually how the Rambam Paskin is actually very interesting. The Rambam in Hilchos Ishus, Perek Yurches Halacha Chaf, writes as follows: Almana Sheba Lebeizin, and this Balak brings together everything. Almana Sheba Lebeizin Litba Mizonos. If an Almana comes to Bezdin to go ahead and collect Mizonos, what's the halacha? Mashbiin Osa Betchila Umochin Below Achraza Minos Mizonos. So we'll say if an Almana comes to collect for Mizonos from the estate, this is all from the estate. So what's the halacha? Before we sell off property to satisfy her mizonos, we make her take a shvuah that she has not collected anything in the interim. All right? Rabbi said, this is a very important detail. A woman is allowed to sell off. A woman is allowed to sell off. She is allowed to sell off property for mazonos, not in Beis Din. Not in Beis Din. So she could just immediately go ahead and sell off property not in Beis Din. And for mazonos. Ella b'shlosh hanashim, but she has to do it in front of, she doesn't have to do it in a Beis Din mumchin, but has to be in some type of Beis Din. V'chedim machra le'mazonos peino la'atzma, shav b'shava machra kayim. Fine. So I'll say, so ultimately, again, bottom line is halacha l'maisa, when she comes to collect from the Yisomim, requires a shvuah. Number two, she could sell off not in front of a formal Beis Din, but ultimately, again, in front of any Beis Din of 3 individuals. And halacha l'maisa, she could sell off for mazonos, right, shava b'shava, for the amount that she needs. But interestingly enough, if she sells off and then the Yisomim want to administer a shvuah, ultimately they have the right to administer that shvuah. Beautiful. Mishnah. Very interesting case. Very interesting case here. And Almana has a ksuva that's worth 200 zuz. And I will say, what does she do? This is fascinating. She takes a property that is worth 1 mana, 100 zuz, and she sells it for 200. Gewaldig. Businesswoman. Right? So she takes a property that's worth 100, she sells it for 200. Now I will say that's case 1. Right? Machar shavanu masayim. Oh, shava masayim b'mana. Or she takes a property worth 200 zuz and what? Sells it for 100. So here she undersells it. What's talacha? This kablu ksuvasa. Either way, Rabosai, we're done. She's got her ksuva. Right? Either in case number 1, because she walked away with 200 zuz, or in case number 2, because she got a piece of property worth 200 zuz. So we're done. Haisik ksuvasa mana machra shava mana v'dinar b'mana michra batal. We'll say case number 3. This is fascinating. Let's say her ksuva is worth a mana, 100, and she took a field. Machra shava mana v'dinar mana. She takes a field that is worth a mana and a dinar. So let's just call it. Her ksuva is 100 mana. Is 100 zuz. She takes a field that's worth 101 zuz, and she sells it for 100 zuz. What's talacha? Michra batal. The sale is void. Now, we'll say, why is the sale void? Because since the field was worth 101 zuz, she wasn't entitled to that field. She took something she was not entitled to, and she sold it off. Well, if you take something you're not entitled to, then ultimately you have no rights in it. You have no rights. And we'll say, her right to sell off a piece of property is a piece of property, what? Up to the value of the ksuva. She has no rights in property above the value of the ksuva. So she takes a price of property that's worth 101 zuz. You have no rights in that. Therefore, michra batal. Even afilu hi omeres achzir din liyoshim. First wide line. Even if she says, don't get all excited. I'm willing to refund the additional amount to the estate to the Yarshim. Still doesn't work. Michra batal. So we'll say. So this is fascinating. And again, it's very intuitive. Tanakama is saying, you can't sell something you don't have a lien against. And for a ksuva, the most you only have a lien against an actual piece of property that is the value of the ksuva. If it's more than the value of the ksuva, you have no claim against it. Now here, watch this. Rav Shimon comes along and says, the olam michra kayim. Rav Shimon says, not true. Halacha l'maisa, she has a potential lien or claim even against property that is worth more than the value of the ksuva, up to the point that what? Ad shetehisham kedei sheteshayir besada bas tisha kabin ubegina bas chatzi kav. Shavuot said, it's actually very interesting. So Shimon says, listen, the truth is, she has a shtickle claim, bless you, even in property that ultimately, again, is worth more than the value of the ksuva, as long as what? It would be a field where there would be more than 9 kav left over in the field, or in a garden, at least more than a half a kav left over. Ukdiv Rabbi Kiva, base rov. According to Rabbi Akiva, a quarter of a kav. Or as we'll say, what they're saying is like this. If she goes ahead and she sells off property that's worth more than the value of her ksuva, as long as it's not so much more, right? So much more. What's the definition of so much more? So that's these different. We'll get into this in the Gemara. So essentially, Rav Shimon Gamliel is saying, as long as there's not more than 9 kav left in the field, a half a kav left in the garden. Rabbi Akiva says a quarter of a kav. So as long as she's not leaving over that much, in other words, as long as there's not that much more left over in the field after she sells it, more than her ksuva, the sale is okay. Now, obviously, she can't pocket the extra money, right? That extra money goes back into the Yisomim, but Lamaisa wouldn't invalidate the sale. So we'll get into this a little bit more. Interesting case. Let's say Kesuvos was worth 400 zuz. Watch this. So also listen to this case. Right? Rachel's married to Reuven. Reuven promised her a ksuva of 400 zuz. Incredible. Generous guy. Now what happens? He dies. She's now selling off property to collect her ksuva. So watch this case. First parcel, she sells off for 100 zuz. Good? Yes. Second parcel sells off for 100 zuz. Good. Third parcel, 100 zuz. Great. Now we're up to our last 100 zuz. She sells off the last parcel for 101 zuz. What's the halacha? So we'll say, so here's what's interesting. Now, obviously, we just got finished saying, at least according to the Tanakama, that if you oversell property, right? If you sell property that's worth more than what you're owed, the sale is batal. The sale is batal. So we'll say, so now watch this. When she sells off that last piece of parcel, so how do we look at it? Do we look at that one transaction in a vacuum, right? Just about that one parcel? Or do we look at that transaction or do we look at that last piece as part of a whole transaction? So the Gemara ends off by saying, the Gemara says, Shal acharon batal v'shal kulan kayim. The last transaction is batal, all of the other ones are good. Or in other words, we'll say, we look at the transactions as independent transactions, and halacha l'maisa, again, only the last one is the one she overpaid, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the last one, or not overpaid, I'm sorry, the last one is where she sold the parcel she wasn't entitled to, so that one's not good, but the previous 3 transactions are still good. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, here we go. So also listen to this. We're going back to the first case of Mishnah. What was the first case of Mishnah? First case of Mishnah was a woman takes a field that's worth 200 zuz and she sells it for 100. What do we tell her? Listen, we're done. But one second, she only walked away with 100 zuz. It's true, she walked with 100 zuz. What do you tell her? You caused yourself to lose out. In other words, you had a field that was worth 200 zuz. You undersold it, it's your problem. It's your loss. Well, if that's the case, why can't she see Rabbi in the case of what? Where she took a 100 zuz field and sold it for 200, why can't she say what? I made profit. So Yisomim, you still owe me 100 zuz. In other words, I took a field that was worth 100 zuz, sold it for 200. Really, that extra 100 of profit is mine. You Yisomim owe me what? Another 100 zuz, but it's not what the Mishnah says. Right? The Mishnah says that halacha, if she took a 100 zuz field and sold it for 200 zuz, what's the halacha? She's done. She's gotten her ksuva. Amar Nachman Amar Baravua Amar Beis Kan Shana Rebbe Hakol Lebalamos. I will say, great sugi here. This is a bigger discussion. That when you are transacting business with someone else's money, all profits accrue to the owner of the money. All profits accrue to the owner of the money. Now I will say, watch this. This is great. Kidisanya. Fascinating Gemara. Kidisanya. Hosifala achaz esera hakol shleati Rabbi Yehuda. So I will say, listen to this interesting case. So now imagine for a moment, Reuven asks me to purchase something for him. He gives me money. I go out to purchase it. And what happens? The vendor gives me extra. Well, again, I'm purposely being vague about the case because we're going to distinguish in just a moment. The vendor gives me extra. So we'll say, what's the shaila? Who gets to keep the extra? So, by the way, Reuven sends me to do something. Maybe I know the vendor. Maybe the vendor's in a good mood. He gives me extra. Who gets to keep it? So the Gemara Rabbi Yehuda says extra is kept by the shaliach. It's kept by the shaliach. Rabbi Yossi says cholkin. Rabbi Yossi says no. If you get any extra, we split that ultimately again between the shaliach and the mishaliach, between the agent, and the, what do you call it, the guy who sends him, the mishaliach? Principal, thank you. The principal, I'm sorry? No, there's no, generally, you're asking how is she getting 200 zuz for a $100 field? Excellent question. Not that we take questions during shir, but if we did, right? But if we did, what I would tell you is like this. Karka, real estate, is the one area where there is no ona. It's actually a very important point I will say. Ona means halach of overcharging. Real estate, there's no ona. And that's because Chazal, it's so fascinating, Chazal already understood that real estate, right, karka means different things to different people. So therefore, again, because the market also fluctuates so dramatically, no ona. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. So we'll say, listen to this. So therefore, again, so Reuven sends me to get something. So ultimately, the vendor gives me extra. So who gets to keep it? The shaliach or the principal? So ultimately, again, Hakol Shaliach, Rabbi Yehuda says, Shaliach keeps everything. Rabbi Yossi says, Cholkin. We split it. One second. Vatanya, Rabbi Yossi, Omer Kol Balamos. But yet we learned elsewhere that Rabbi Yossi doesn't say split it. Rabbi Yossi says everything goes to the owner of the money. In other words, Rabbi Yossi's sheet is, listen, it's very nice that I'm Reuven Shaliach, but at the end of the day, what am I transacting business with? With Reuven's money. If I'm transacting business with Reuven's money, then by definition, anything extra should go to Reuven. So we'll say, so yet, again, so it's stira and Rabbi Yossi. It's not a contradiction. We'll say, listen to how fascinating this is. Not a contradiction. We'll say we're talking about different kinds of items. Items that are sold as units, items that are not sold as units. What does this mean? We'll say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, literally, it means an item that has a set amount. What is it? What's an example of this? Rashi says, "Kegon kitnis hanimkar bechanas b'mida, mole kli bepruta, imosifo achas yisera cholkin dimatana havi yeshomer l'shliach nasna v'yeshomer l'ba'maos nasna." Rabbi say, so when you have an item that's sold in specific measurements, see, the example Rashi gives is kitnis, right? Legumes. So legumes were often sold. You would buy a cup full of legumes. So let's say now the vendor gives me some extra. So that's a matana. That's viewed as a gift. But what? I don't know who the gift is for. Is the gift for me, the shaliach? Is the gift for Reuven, the principal? So therefore, because I don't know who the gift is for, therefore what? Split it. Versus a davar she'ein lo kitzva. Rashi says, for example, kigon talis, the chaluk, the yerek hanim karim ba'omed. Now we'll say davar she'ein lo kitzva would be like a cloak, or for that matter, again, vegetables which are sold by weight. In this case, pamim mevater limkar bezol, pamim b'tzimtzum, hakola ba'alama she'ein kamatana. So we'll say, what's interesting is there are certain items. Davar she'ein lo kitzva means items that are always sold by a certain measure. So I will say, so therefore, again, let's just use Rashi's example of legumes. Legumes were always sold by the cupful. That's the way it was. It didn't matter what store you went to. So if you get a cupful of lentils plus, it's clear that what's the plus? I will say, what's the plus? It's a matana. Now, what's the shayla? Who is the matana for? Okay, I don't know who the matana is for. Therefore, cholkin. Versus something that's not always sold in exact measurement. What's a good example of this? So apparently vegetables, which were sometimes sold by weight. So we'll say, so depending on price fluctuations, different things, sometimes you got more, you got less. A talis, a cloak, depending on the vendor, you'll get it for cheaper, more expensive. So in this case, where there's a price fluctuation, ultimately, again, every gain, no matter every loss as well, goes to the balamos. Ultimately goes to the owner of the money. Quite fascinating. Papa says, Hilchasa, davar sheish lo kitzva, cholkin. If something ultimately, again, is always sold by a specific measure and you get more, that additional amount is split. Davar she'ino kitzva hakala balamos. Ultimately, again, everything that is not sold in general by a specific amount, anything extra goes to the owner of the money. So my kamash malon. So what are we being taught over here? Shinuya deshanina shiniyahu. First, we're just being taught that the distinction we made before is indeed a correct distinction. Ibari lahu amar le zabin li liska va'azal v'zabin le kura. So we'll say now we get into another fascinating sugya. We'll at least start this question and we'll end off with here for today. We'll say this in the following question. Let's say I say to a shaliach, go and purchase from me a liska of land. Liska is an amount. The shaliach goes ahead and purchases a kor, which is a liska plus. Liska plus. So what's the shaila? How do we look at this transaction? Mai, mosif al dvarafu v'liska miyakani, al dilma ma'avir al dvarafu v'liska nami lokani. So I'm going to leave you on this cliffhanger. This is actually incredible. Essentially, when you go ahead and you commission a shaliach to do something, and he does more than what you asked of him, so how do we view now the agency? Do we say, so let's watch this case. So let's say I go ahead and I tell a shaliach, buy a half an acre of land. And he what? He buys an acre. So do we say, at least for the half an acre, he bought a half an acre. So for that part, the shlichus is good, for the additional part it's not? Or do we say, no, when you went above and beyond what I told you to do, essentially what did you do? You're operating outside of the realm of the agency. And once you're operating out of the realm of the agency, then what? Then ultimately, again, there's nothing more to discuss. You've negated the agency. So stop over here for today. And great, I'm just telling you, right coming attractions, great, overwhelming, incredible sugya tomorrow. And Miras Hashem to be continued. We're fine. We'll catch up in Miras Hashem. We'll say shkoyach. Shkoyach, a good night, everyone. Yerachmiel, you want to start? All right, perfect. Good night. Thank you so much for the beautiful